A palace door slams shut with the sound of final authority. In the gilded corridors of European royalty, a single forbidden romance threatened to shatter centuries of tradition. This is the story of a love so scandalous it sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of society. By the end of this tale, you will understand the true human cost of trading a heart for a title. It was the late 19th century, a world of immense wealth and even stricter rules, where personal desire was always sacrificed for dynastic duty. How did one American heiress find the courage to defy an empire? What secret love persisted behind the cold walls of an ancient palace? In an age where appearances were everything, the truth became the most dangerous weapon of all. What does it truly mean to choose between duty and love? Across the Atlantic, a new kind of empire was rising, forged not from land or lineage, but from steel and railroads. This was America's Gilded Age, a time of explosive industrial wealth that created a class of millionaires almost overnight. Their mansions were palaces, their parties were legendary, but one thing their money could not buy was the one thing they craved most: social legitimacy. In the eyes of the old money elite of New York and Boston, they were still considered new money and therefore outsiders. So these wealthy American families looked east, across the ocean, to a very different kind of aristocracy. In Europe, ancient noble families lived in sprawling ancestral castles, their bloodlines tracing back for centuries. They possessed impeccable titles and unparalleled social standing. But they had a problem. Many were land-rich and cash-poor, their vast estates struggling to generate the funds needed for their lavish lifestyles. A perfect, if cynical, exchange was born. American heiresses, nicknamed dollar princesses, became the most valuable export. A father's immense fortune would be traded for a daughter's royal title, a business transaction disguised as a marriage. It was a simple equation: American money for European nobility. This transatlantic trade in titles and cash set the stage for countless unions, but it also created a powder keg. What happened when a young woman, raised with the independent spirit of the New World, was shipped off to marry a stranger and dropped into the rigid, unforgiving structure of an old world court? The stage was set for a scandal that would be different from all the others. A story not just of a broken contract, but of a forbidden love that refused to be silenced. The ancient stones of Blenheim Palace held a legacy of victory and power. This was the ancestral seat of the Spencer-Churchill family, the Dukes of Marlborough, a dynasty whose name was synonymous with British military glory and political influence. Their home was not merely a house, it was a national monument, a sprawling masterpiece gifted by a grateful crown for triumphs on the battlefield. To the outside world, they were the pinnacle of aristocratic success, living in a palace that dwarfed the homes of many monarchs. Yet behind the grand facades and priceless art collections lay a secret struggle. The very weight of their history was crushing them. The costs of maintaining such an estate were astronomical, and the family's finances were dwindling, trapped in a web of entailed estates and centuries-old obligations. They were, in the starkest terms, palace rich and cash poor. This created an unbearable pressure on the heirs of this great house. The future of Blenheim itself depended on them making a brilliant match, a marriage that would inject vast new wealth into the family coffers. The burden fell first upon the eldest son, the Marquess of Blandford, whose duty was clear: find a fortune. When he failed to secure a suitable heiress, the weight of this financial rescue mission shifted unexpectedly to his younger brother, Lord Randolph Churchill. He was a man of ambition and intellect, poised for a career in politics, but his family's survival demanded a different kind of sacrifice. His path was no longer his own to choose, for the fate of a dukedom and a palace now rested on his willingness to trade his name for a stranger's money. Into this world of calculated alliances was born Consuelo Vanderbilt, a child whose very name meant consolation, yet whose life would offer her little of it. She was not merely wealthy. She was the heiress to one of the greatest fortunes on earth, a fortune built by her father's family from railroads and shipping. Her childhood was spent in a series of magnificent New York mansions, but the most imposing presence was not the marble or the gold leaf. It was her mother, Alva Vanderbilt. Alva was a woman of ferocious social ambition, determined to crush the old New York families that had once snubbed her. She saw her stunningly beautiful daughter not as a child to be cherished, but as the ultimate weapon in her social war, a perfect instrument to secure a title that would finally make the Vanderbilts untouchable. From her earliest years, Consuelo was groomed for this single purpose. She was educated by tutors in languages, music, and etiquette, not for her own enrichment, but to make her a flawless candidate for a European drawing room. Her every movement, her every word was policed and corrected. She was even forced to wear a steel rod strapped to her back and neck during her lessons to ensure perfect, regal posture. This was not a home, it was a finishing school for a future queen, and Alva was its ruthless headmistress. The gilded cage Consuelo inhabited had no visible bars, only the relentless pressure of expectation. Her value was measured not in her character or her mind, but in the size of her dowry and the perfection of her profile. She was being meticulously prepared for a transaction, a living, breathing bond to be exchanged for the highest possible title, with her own mother acting as the broker. Alva Vanderbilt's ambition was a force of nature, meticulously engineered and utterly relentless. She did not simply want a good marriage for her daughter. She demanded a spectacular one, a union that would be the crowning achievement of her own social ascent. Every party she hosted, every introduction she engineered, was a calculated move in a grand chess game where Consuelo was the most valuable piece. The girl's beauty and immense fortune made her a target for every fortune hunter in two hemispheres, but Alva was the impenetrable gatekeeper. She controlled every aspect of Consuelo's life, filtering her friendships and ruthlessly cutting off any young man who showed a flicker of genuine romantic interest. These suitors, deemed merely American and therefore unsuitable, were dismissed without a second thought. Consuelo's own feelings were irrelevant, a trivial detail in the grand blueprint her mother was drawing. The true object of Alva's desire began to crystallize across the Atlantic, the dukedom of Marlborough. It was one of the most prestigious titles in all of England, attached to a palace that was a national treasure. For Alva, it was the ultimate prize. She began plotting with the cold precision of a general, gathering intelligence on the Churchill family's financial distress and positioning her daughter as the perfect solution. She ensured Consuelo's name was mentioned in the right circles, that her photograph found its way into the right hands. The pressure on the young heiress was immense and constant, a psychological vise tightening with each passing day. Her life was not her own. It was a commodity being prepared for auction, and her mother was both the auctioneer and the sole bidder for her future. How does a young heart survive when it is treated as a business asset, when every glance and every smile is scrutinized for its market value rather than its human meaning? Lord Randolph Churchill was a man caught between two worlds. He possessed a brilliant, restless mind, fiercely ambitious for a career in the turbulent arena of British politics. He dreamed of power, of influence, of leaving his own mark on history through his intellect and oratory. Yet he was perpetually shackled by the very name that opened doors for him. The Spencer Churchill name came with a legacy, but it did not come with the ready cash required to grease the wheels of a political machine. A life in London society, the necessary dinners, the campaigns, the expected displays of wealth, all demanded a fortune he simply did not have. His own family's estate was a magnificent, money-draining burden. So when the possibility of an alliance with the Vanderbilt family emerged, it did not appear as a romantic proposition, but as a strategic necessity. For Lord Randolph, Consuelo Vanderbilt was not merely a pretty young woman. She was the answer to a pressing financial equation. Her astronomical wealth represented freedom, the freedom to pursue his political destiny without the constant, humiliating worry over funds. The fact that he was more than a decade older than her was of little consequence in such a transaction. The absence of any personal connection was irrelevant. In the calculus of aristocracy, her money and his title were a perfect, if cold, match. He was not marrying a person. He was acquiring a financial lifeline, one that would secure his future and, by extension, help stabilize the future of Blenheim Palace itself. This was the reality of the deal, a union built on mutual need, where his political ambitions and her family's social ones would be fused together in a bond that had no room for something as fragile as love. Their paths finally crossed in a London drawing room, an encounter as meticulously planned as a military operation. The young Consuelo, barely 18, stood poised and elegant, a vision of youthful grace meticulously sculpted by her mother's relentless training. Yet beneath the perfect posture and the demure smile, her heart was a frantic flutter of apprehension. She was meeting the man who held the key to her gilded cage, Lord Randolph Churchill. He was a figure from another world, a man in his late 20s with an air of weary intelligence and a demeanor that was polite, yet profoundly detached. He observed her not with the warmth of a potential suitor, but with the cool assessment of a businessman evaluating a new asset. Their conversations were brief, formal, and entirely chaperoned, revolving around the safe topics of London weather and society gossip. There were no stolen glances, no shared laughter, no moments of genuine connection. For Consuelo, it felt like an audition for a role she never wanted to play, her every word and gesture being silently graded against a checklist of aristocratic suitability. After a whirlwind of such orchestrated meetings, the expected moment arrived. Lord Randolph requested a private audience, a formality that held the weight of her entire future. He did not get down on one knee. He did not speak of affection or devotion. Instead, he presented a proposition, clear, cold, and utterly devoid of sentiment. He formally asked for her hand in marriage, framing it not as a union of hearts, but as a merger of two great houses. He explained with a chilling pragmatism that her family's fortune would stabilize his family's estate and fund his political ambitions, while his title would grant her and her family the social pinnacle they so desperately craved. Her feelings, her hopes, her own dreams for a life of love were treated as irrelevant variables in this grand equation. The contract was set, the terms were clear, and the young heiress was left with the devastating understanding that she was not a bride, but a business acquisition. But there was another man, a secret that Consuelo guarded deep within her heart. His name was Winthrop Rutherfurd. Unlike the titled European aristocrats her mother pursued, Winthrop was an American, from a family that was respectable and well-connected, but possessed no title, no ancient lineage, and therefore, in Alva Vanderbilt's eyes, no value whatsoever. He was handsome, athletic, and most importantly, he saw Consuelo not as an heiress or a strategic asset, but as the young woman she truly was. Theirs was a genuine, youthful romance that bloomed in the rare, unguarded moments away from her mother's iron control. They met at social functions where, for a few precious minutes, they could exchange more than just polite pleasantries. Their connection was immediate and deep, built on shared laughter and quiet conversations that felt utterly real. They arranged secret meetings during carriage rides in the park, their hands briefly brushing, their words full of promise. They exchanged letters, tender and heartfelt, which Consuelo had to hide with the utmost care, knowing their discovery would mean instant ruin. In Winthrop's presence, she did not have to be the perfect dollar princess. She could simply be Consuelo. This hidden relationship offered her a glimpse of an entirely different life, one based on mutual affection and personal choice. A life that was the absolute opposite of the cold, transactional future her mother had engineered with Lord Randolph Churchill. It was a stark contrast that tore at her soul, the warmth of a stolen glance against the chilling formality of her official engagement. How could she possibly reconcile the man who made her heart soar with the title she was being forced to marry? The fragile world of secret letters and stolen glances came crashing down with the force of a hurricane. Alva Vanderbilt discovered her daughter's affection for Winthrop Rutherfurd, and her reaction was not one of maternal concern, but of cold, calculated fury. Her entire grand design, the masterpiece of her social ascent, was on the verge of being ruined by a simple, foolish emotion. She immediately moved to crush this rebellion with absolute finality. Consuelo was dragged from the room where she had been reading one of Winthrop's letters, her private sanctuary violated. Her mother's face was a mask of icy rage. She confiscated every hidden note, every token of affection, and then she delivered her punishment. Consuelo was locked in her bedroom, a prisoner in her own opulent home. For days, she was confined with only a maid for company, the heavy door a constant reminder of her powerlessness. But physical confinement was only the beginning of Alva's psychological warfare. She played her most devastating card. She entered Consuelo's room and stood before her, not as a mother, but as a warden delivering a sentence. She told her daughter that her father, William Vanderbilt, was gravely ill, his heart weakened by the stress of business. Then she twisted the knife, looking Consuelo directly in the eye and stating that if she persisted in this disobedience, if she refused the Churchill marriage, The resulting scandal and disappointment would kill him. She placed the full, terrible weight of her father's potential death squarely on her daughter's shoulders. The ultimatum was delivered with chilling clarity. "You will marry Lord Randolph Churchill," Alva declared, "or you will be cut off from this family forever. You will never see your father or your brothers again. You will be disowned, destitute, and utterly alone in the world, and you will have your father's death on your conscience." It was a masterstroke of emotional blackmail, weaponizing a daughter's love for her father to shatter her spirit. Trapped, isolated, and burdened with a guilt no young person should ever bear, Consuelo's resistance finally broke. The choice was not between two men, but between fulfilling a brutal duty or destroying her own family. With a heart full of despair, she surrendered, accepting the fate that had been written for her long before she was born. The transaction was secure, but at what cost to the human soul forced to sign the contract? The 5th of August, 1895, dawned on a city gripped by a singular fever. New York had never seen a spectacle quite like the Vanderbilt Churchill wedding. Outside St. Thomas Church, a crowd of thousands swarmed the streets, held back by a battalion of police officers. They pushed and strained for a glimpse of the arriving carriages, a sea of faces staring up at the grand stone facade. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of thousands of white orchids and the low, excited murmur of the most exclusive guest list in America. Every pillar was draped in lush greenery and brilliant white flowers, transforming the church into a scented forest of unimaginable luxury. It was a public celebration of a private transaction, and all of society had come to witness the signing. At the center of this opulent storm, in a room away from the clamor, stood the bride. Consuelo Vanderbilt was a vision in a gown of ivory Duchess satin, its train measuring an astonishing 18 feet, a regal burden she would have to carry. The dress, embroidered with seed pearls and valued at a staggering $6,000, was a masterpiece of the Gilded Age, yet it felt like a leaden shroud. As her maids adjusted the historic rose point lace veil, a family heirloom loaned by the Vanderbilts to add an air of antique nobility, Consuelo could not stop the tears that streamed down her face. Her mother, Alva, stood watchful and immovable, a general on the morning of her greatest victory. There was no comfort offered, only a final, sharp reminder of duty. The sobbing bride was told in no uncertain terms to cease, to compose herself, to play her part. The show must go on, and she was its star performer. The first notes of the wedding march echoed through the vast church, and every head turned. On the arm of her father, who looked pale and solemn, Consuelo began the long walk down the aisle. To the guests, she was the picture of aristocratic perfection, a serene and beautiful heiress stepping into her destiny. But behind the delicate lace of her veil, her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She moved as if in a trance, a prisoner in silk and satin, each step taking her further from the life she had dreamed of and closer to a stranger at the altar. The man waiting for her, Lord Randolph Churchill, appeared just as detached, his expression one of polite obligation. As she reached him, the weight of the moment was not the sacred union of two souls, but the cold, final click of a lock. The bishop's voice boomed through the sanctuary, asking who gives this woman to be married. Her father's quiet response was the last formality in a business deal that had been settled long before this day. While the organ thundered and the congregation beamed, Consuelo's heart was breaking for another man an ocean away. With every vow she repeated, she thought of Winthrop Rutherfurd, of his honest smile and the warmth of his hand. The gold ring slipped onto her finger felt like a brand, a permanent mark of her surrender. She was trading her youth, her freedom, and any chance at love for a title her mother coveted. The ceremony concluded to a triumphant swell of music, and the new Lady Churchill turned to face the crowd, a flawless mask hiding a profound and private despair. She had fulfilled her contract with a broken heart, becoming a duchess in a golden cage, her spirit left weeping at the altar while her body moved on to the reception. What kind of life begins on a foundation of such profound personal sorrow? The wedding tour ended not with a honeymoon of shared discovery, but with a chilling arrival at her new home. Consuelo stepped across the threshold of Blenheim Palace and was immediately swallowed by its scale. This was not a home, it was a cold, echoing monument. The sheer vastness of the place was staggering, with corridors so long they seemed to vanish into gloom and cavernous rooms where voices were lost in the emptiness. A perpetual damp chill clung to the ancient stone walls, a cold that no number of roaring fireplaces could ever truly dispel. For a young woman raised in the modern, centrally heated mansions of New York, this was a profound physical and cultural shock. The sheer weight of centuries felt oppressive, a constant reminder that she was merely a temporary resident in a story written long before she was born. Her new life was governed by a rigid, unyielding schedule of formality. Every meal was a state occasion, every interaction laced with protocol. She was surrounded by a small army of servants, yet felt utterly alone. The one person who should have been her companion in this strange new world, her husband, remained a distant, polite stranger. Lord Randolph retreated into his political work and his own circles, offering no guidance, no friendship, no warmth. Their conversations were brief and functional, revolving around household management or social obligations. The Gilded Cage now had stone bars and a title etched above the door. Her primary purpose in this grand and lonely existence was made brutally clear from the outset. She was there to secure the Marlborough lineage. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense and ever-present, a topic discussed with a chilling, clinical detachment by the family. She was not a wife, she was a vessel for the continuation of a dynasty, a breeding mare in the most magnificent of stables. How does a heart survive when its only recognized function is biological, when its deepest longings for connection are treated as irrelevant, even inconvenient? A cold, perfect smile became Consuelo's most essential accessory in London society. She performed her duties as Lady Randolph Churchill with flawless grace, hosting dinners and attending balls. Yet the truth has a way of seeping through the cracks in even the most polished facade. Whispers began to circulate in the gilded drawing rooms of Mayfair, spoken behind fluttering fans and over cups of tea. The story was simply too dramatic, too full of Gothic details, to remain a secret forever. The tale of the sobbing bride, the locked bedroom, and the mother's ruthless ultimatum spread from one aristocratic ear to another. Gossip is the true currency of any court, and the story of the Vanderbilt-Churchill marriage was a treasure trove. People spoke of the American heiress, who had been visibly weeping behind her veil, a stark contrast to the triumphant narrative presented in the newspapers. They murmured about the handsome American, Winthrop Rutherfurd, and the secret romance that had been so brutally extinguished. Alva Vanderbilt, once admired for her ambition, was now discussed in hushed, horrified tones. Her role was not seen as that of a strategic mother, but as a tyrant who had emotionally blackmailed her own child. The scandal was no longer a private family tragedy. It was public entertainment for the very highest circles. The forced nature of the union became an open secret, a topic that raised eyebrows and inspired pitying glances whenever the young Lady Churchill entered a room. This public dissection struck at the very heart of the system these people upheld. The exchange of American money for European titles was a practical arrangement everyone understood, but Alva's methods were seen as shockingly cruel, even by the cynical standards of the day. It forced society to look in the mirror and question the morality of their own traditions. How many other young women had been sacrificed in similar, if less dramatic, transactions? The whispers about Consuelo were not just about one broken heart. They were a quiet indictment of an entire social structure built on the calculated sale of human beings. The perfect facade of the dollar princess system was showing a deep, ugly crack, and everyone was staring at it. For the world, Consuelo was the perfect duchess. She presided over Blenheim's endless dinner parties with a serene smile, her impeccable French charming diplomats, and her knowledge of art impressing connoisseurs. She managed the vast household with an efficiency that surprised the old retainers, and she became a celebrated hostess in their London home, a glittering figure in a world of tiaras and titles. In the eyes of society, the transaction had been a brilliant success. The Vanderbilt money had restored the palace's roofs and refilled its stables, and the Marlborough title had granted the Vanderbilts the social supremacy Alva had waged war to achieve. The external picture was one of flawless aristocratic harmony. The final, crucial piece of this public performance fell into place with the birth of her sons. First came John, the Marquess of Blandford, the heir who would one day secure the dukedom. Then came a second son, Ivor, providing the proverbial spare. With the arrival of these two boys, Consuelo had fulfilled her primary dynastic duty. She had delivered the future. Yet the nursery, for all its warmth and childish laughter, was a world away from her own cold and lonely rooms. The marriage behind the glittering facade was a hollow shell. She and Lord Randolph lived almost entirely separate lives, occupying different wings of the enormous palace. They maintained separate bedrooms, a common aristocratic practice, but in their case, it was a symbol of a profound emotional chasm. He was frequently absent, immersed in his political career or his own private pursuits, leaving her alone for weeks and months at a time in the cavernous halls of Blenheim. When they were together, their interactions were polite, formal, and utterly devoid of intimacy. He was not unkind, merely indifferent, a distant partner in a business that had concluded with the signing of the marriage register and the birth of the heirs. Consuelo moved through her beautiful, lonely existence like a ghost in her own home, a woman trapped in a gilded frame, admired by everyone and truly known by no one. She had everything society said she should want, and yet she had nothing of what the heart truly needs. How long can a person live a double life, performing perfection for the public, while their private world is a silent, empty room? The chill of Blenheim Palace could not be kept out by silk gowns or roaring fires, but Consuelo discovered a different kind of warmth in the most unlikely of places. She began stepping beyond the palace gates, away from the stifling formalities of her own life, and into the cramped, soot-stained villages on the Marlborough estates. There, she witnessed a poverty so profound it shocked her conscience. Here was a world of struggle far removed from the gilded ballrooms of London, a reality where children went barefoot and families lived in single, damp rooms. This was not the picturesque poverty of a painting. It was raw, immediate, and demanded a response. For the first time in her life, the title of Duchess was not a hollow honorific, but a tool she could actually use. She began to wield it with purpose, establishing schools and clinics, and using her own substantial allowance to fund improvements in housing and sanitation. This was not the performative charity of a society lady. It was a deeply personal mission. In the faces of the struggling mothers and their children, she saw a reflection of her own powerlessness, and in helping them, she began to reclaim a fragment of her own agency. How does a person who has been treated as an object learn to act as a subject of their own life? For Consuelo, the answer began with a simple act of looking outward and seeing a need she had the power to fill. Her work with the poor naturally led her to a movement that was shaking the very foundations of British society, the fight for women's suffrage. Here, she found a language for the frustrations she had endured her entire life. The suffragettes spoke of autonomy, of the right to self-determination, of breaking free from the control of others, and their words resonated with a painful, perfect clarity. She remembered the steel rod strapped to her back, a physical manifestation of her mother's control. She remembered the locked bedroom door and the emotional ultimatum that had stolen her future. The suffragettes were fighting against the very system that had treated her as a commodity to be traded. She began to attend meetings, at first quietly listening from the back of the room. But soon, she was using her position and her formidable skills as a hostess to organize fundraising events, drawing wealthy and influential figures into the cause. She lent her title, her name, and her impeccable social credibility to a movement that was often mocked and derided. For Consuelo, this was not just politics. It was a profound act of personal alignment. She was finally using the platform her miserable marriage had given her to champion the very principle her mother had so violently denied her: a woman's right to choose her own path. This transformation from a passive victim into a woman of purpose was a quiet revolution. The same hands that had once trembled while signing a marriage register now confidently signed checks for new schools. The voice that had been trained only to make polite conversation at dinner parties was now used to articulate arguments for women's rights. In the bustling energy of a charity committee or the charged atmosphere of a suffrage meeting, she found a community and a sense of self-worth that her title had never provided. She was no longer just the Duchess of Marlborough, the perfect ornament in a gilded cage. She was Consuelo, a force for tangible good. The little girl who had been groomed for a single transaction was becoming a woman who understood the power of building something that lasted. She was constructing a legacy not of lineage, but of compassion and change, finding a voice that was entirely her own, a voice that had been waiting a lifetime to speak. What happens when a person who is sold for a title decides to use that title not for prestige, but for power of a different kind? Yet through all her public triumphs and private acts of charity, one ghost remained. Winthrop Rutherfurd never truly left the edges of her world. While Consuelo was performing the part of a duchess, he had built a life of his own, marrying an American woman named Lucy Morton and starting a family. They moved in the same rarefied social circles, their paths crossing at London season events or at country house parties across England. In these glittering rooms, a peculiar dance began. They would exchange the most polite of greetings, their words perfectly calibrated for public consumption. "How do you do, Lady Marlborough? How are you, Mr. Rutherfurd?" The formality was a shield, a necessary performance for the watching eyes of society. But beneath the surface of those brief, scripted interactions, an entire history screamed in silence. There were the lingering glances, a fraction of a second too long, that spoke of a life unlived. A shared, almost imperceptible pause when their hands briefly met in a handshake, a fleeting touch that carried the memory of a stolen moment in a New York park. Their conversations were a minefield of unspoken words, every polite inquiry about health or family masking the deeper, more painful questions that could never be asked. Did you think of me? Are you happy? Do you ever wonder what might have been? It was a special kind of torture, to be so close to the man who represented her stolen freedom, yet separated by an unbreachable wall of duty and circumstance. He was the living embodiment of the path not taken, a constant, quiet reminder that the heart she had been forced to lock away was still capable of feeling a profound and aching loss. This unspoken connection became a thread of quiet tragedy woven through the fabric of her gilded life, a love that refused to die, forced to exist only in the silent space between a glance and a polite, painful smile. How does a heart navigate a world where its greatest love is reduced to a mere social acquaintance? A man you can never truly speak to again. The grandeur of Blenheim Palace could not shield its inhabitants from a private tragedy unfolding within its walls. Lord Randolph Churchill, once a man of sharp intellect and political fire, began a slow, cruel decline, a mysterious illness, whispered by doctors and gossips alike to be syphilis, was systematically dismantling him. His brilliant mind, the very asset he had hoped to leverage with Consuelo's fortune, began to fray, his thoughts becoming confused and his once powerful speeches dissolving into incoherence. His body, too, betrayed him, growing frail and uncoordinated. The man who had been a distant partner was now a spectral figure, a heartbreaking remnant of the stranger she had married. In this profound crisis, Consuelo's response was not one of resentment, but of unwavering duty. Despite the emotional chasm that had always existed between them, she became his primary caretaker. She arranged for specialists, managed his medications, and oversaw his comfort with a stoic grace that surprised even the most cynical observers. She sat with him during his lucid moments and shielded him from public view during his worst. This was not the act of a loving wife, but of a woman of profound character, honoring a vow she had made under duress, fulfilling a responsibility to a fellow human being in their most vulnerable state. His death was not a shock, but a sad, drawn-out conclusion. When he finally passed, the elaborate rituals of Victorian mourning descended upon Consuelo. She entered a world of black crepe, known as widow's weeds, her entire wardrobe and household transformed into a monument of grief. For the outside world, she was the bereaved duchess, performing the part with impeccable dignity. But beneath the black veil, her emotions were a tangled web. There was certainly sadness, a genuine pity for the wasted life of a man she had never truly known. Yet intertwined with that sorrow was something else, something she could never admit in public, a profound and terrifying sense of liberation. The contract was over. The business arrangement that had dictated every aspect of her adult life had reached its natural, if tragic, conclusion. She was 28 years old, a widow, a mother of 2 sons, and for the first time since her girlhood, she was free. The heavy title of Duchess of Marlborough remained, but the man who had been its other half was gone. The cage door, rusted shut for so long, had finally creaked open. What does a bird do when it has spent its entire life in a gilded cage, only to find the door suddenly ajar? Freedom tasted like foreign air in the salt spray of an ocean crossing. For Consuelo, the heavy black crepe of widowhood was not just a symbol of loss. It was an unexpected cloak of liberation. At 28, she was one of the youngest and wealthiest dowagers in England, finally in command of her own fortune and her own choices. She began to travel, not as an accessory to a politician husband, but on her own terms. She explored the art galleries of Florence and the sun-drenched villas of the Italian lakes, her mind expanding with each new landscape. In these places, far from the watchful eyes of English society, the quiet, obedient Duchess began to recede, and a more confident, curious woman emerged. She made new friends, intellectuals, and artists who valued her for her sharp mind and genuine interest in their work, not merely for her title. This was a world where conversations crackled with ideas about modern art and social reform, a stark contrast to the stifling small talk of aristocratic drawing room. With every independent decision, from choosing her own itinerary to forming her own opinions, she was quietly dismantling the gilded cage piece by piece, discovering a self that had been suppressed since girlhood. How does a person learn to walk after a lifetime of being told how to stand? For Consuelo, the answer was found in motion, in putting an ocean between herself and the ghosts of her past. This personal revolution was unfolding against a backdrop of global upheaval. The world itself was shuddering, the old certainties of the aristocratic order beginning to fracture. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo sent political tremors across Europe, threatening the very empires that her marriage had been designed to emulate. The intricate web of alliances between royal cousins, the system that had propped up the old world, was now pulling it toward the abyss of a catastrophic war. The same rigid structures that had dictated her life, the obsession with bloodlines and inherited power, were proving to be dangerously brittle. As nations mobilized for a conflict unlike any other, the Gilded Age was drawing to its bloody close. The value of a duke's title would soon be measured not by the grandeur of his palace, but by his willingness to send the sons of his tenants into the trenches. Consuelo, who had herself been a casualty of that old system, could sense the shifting ground. Her own broken world was a tiny reflection of the larger world about to break. As she gained her freedom, the society that had imprisoned her was beginning to crumble, leaving everyone to wonder what new order might possibly rise from the ashes. The world had shattered and been remade, but the old rules of society still clung to a desperate, fading power. Decades had passed since that weeping bride walked down the aisle, years filled with personal growth and global turmoil. Yet one final, defiant act would cement Consuelo Vanderbilt's story as the ultimate royal scandal. In the year 1920, the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough made a decision that sent a tremor through the very foundations of the aristocracy. She filed for divorce. For a woman of her station to sue for the dissolution of a marriage, especially one that had been the cornerstone of a transatlantic alliance, was an almost unthinkable act of rebellion. In the highest circles, divorce was not a private matter. It was a profound social disgrace, a public admission of failure that could tarnish a family name for generations. It was a step so radical that it was virtually unheard of among the ducal ranks. The legal grounds were as stark as the act itself. Her petition cited her husband's adultery, a charge that named a specific co-respondent, and likely included desertion, pointing to the long, lonely years of their separation. The moment the papers were filed, the news exploded across front pages from London to New York. The scandal was sensational. Headlines screamed the private details of a marriage the public had once been told was a fairy tale. The very same newspapers that had breathlessly covered the wedding a quarter century earlier now feasted on its spectacular collapse. They revisited the old rumors of the sobbing bride and the forced marriage, casting Alva Vanderbilt as the true villain of the piece. In drawing rooms and clubs, people gasped at the audacity of it. She was not quietly seeking a discreet separation. She was publicly suing the Duke, dragging the mighty Marlborough name through the mud of the courts. For the establishment, this was more than just a marriage ending. It was an attack on the system itself. A dollar princess, a woman bought and paid for, was now using the modern legal system to sever the very chains that had bound her. It was a stunning reversal of power. How could a structure built on the silent suffering of women survive when one of its most prominent victims refused to suffer silently any longer? The divorce was not just a personal liberation. It was a public declaration that the Gilded Cage was finally, irrevocably, broken. But the true bombshell was yet to fall. It came not from the courtroom, but from the most unexpected source imaginable, Alva Vanderbilt herself. The woman who had orchestrated the entire marriage, who had locked her daughter in a bedroom and wielded emotional blackmail as a weapon, now performed a stunning public about-face. She provided the divorce court with a sworn affidavit, a legal document that contained a confession so shocking it ripped the facade of propriety from the entire Gilded Age. In her own words, Alva stated that she had coerced her daughter into the marriage, that she had forced Consuelo to accept Lord Randolph Churchill against her will. After a quarter of a century, the truth was officially and irrevocably on the record. The private torment was now a matter of public law. The motivation behind this astonishing act remains a subject of debate. Was it a belated pang of maternal guilt, a final reckoning with the damage she had inflicted on her own child, or was it something else entirely? Alva, in her later years, had become a vocal and passionate suffragette, a champion for women's autonomy. She had undergone her own transformation, perhaps looking back on her past actions with the horrified clarity of a convert. By supporting Consuelo's divorce, she was not just helping her daughter, she was publicly repudiating the very system she had once so ruthlessly exploited. Her affidavit was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the patriarchal traditions that treated women as property. The impact on the divorce case was immediate and devastating. With the architect of the forced marriage testifying to its illegitimacy, the Duke of Marlborough's position became untenable. Alva's confession provided irrefutable evidence that the union was founded on coercion, not consent. It transformed the narrative completely. This was no longer merely a story of a marriage growing apart. It was the story of a crime against a young woman's heart, finally being adjudicated in a court of law. The scandal was no longer just about a broken marriage, but about the brutal mechanics of how such marriages were made. A mother's confession had turned a personal tragedy into a societal indictment. The decree absolute arrived, a single sheet of paper that severed a quarter-century of bondage. With a judge's signature, Consuelo Vanderbilt was finally, legally, free. But her freedom came at a price dictated by the very system she was escaping. She was immediately stripped of the honorific Her Grace, the Duchess of Marlborough, the title for which her entire youth had been traded. Overnight, she became simply Mrs. Consuelo Vanderbilt once more, a woman without a coronet in a world that had defined her by it. Society's reaction was a stark divide, a chasm between the old guard and a new, emerging modernity. To the traditionalists, she was a fallen woman, a scandalous figure who had broken a sacred contract and brought disgrace upon one of England's most revered names. She was quietly blackballed from certain drawing rooms, her name whispered with a mix of pity and condemnation. Yet to a growing number of people, especially women who felt trapped in their own silent arrangements, she was a hero. She had done the unthinkable, publicly choosing personal happiness and authenticity over the suffocating weight of empty tradition. Her divorce was not seen as a failure, but as an act of immense courage, a declaration that a woman's soul was worth more than any title. She had looked at the gilded cage, its door now open, and had chosen to fly, even if it meant leaving the gold plating behind. What is a title, after all, when it is merely the name of your prison? A new chapter began not in a palace, but in the air. Years after her divorce, Consuelo Vanderbilt found her heart's true companion in Jacques Balsan, a pioneering French aviator and industrialist. This union was the absolute opposite of her first, where the marriage to the Duke was a cold transaction between strangers. Her life with Jacques was a warm partnership chosen with clear eyes and a free will. They were not two titles merging for dynastic gain, but two complete individuals building a life together out of mutual affection and deep respect. He was a man of action and modernity, a hero of the early days of flight, representing a future she was finally stepping into on her own terms. Photographs from this time tell a story words cannot. Gone is the stiff, sorrowful posture of the young Duchess. In its place, we see a woman relaxed and smiling, her hand resting comfortably in her husband's, her gaze meeting the camera with a quiet, confident joy. They are often pictured together at their homes in France or on their travels, their body language speaking of an easy intimacy that had been entirely absent from her first marriage. This was not a performance for society. It was the simple, profound happiness of a shared life. After decades of being either a daughter obeying a mother or a wife serving a dynasty, Consuelo had finally found an equal. Jack did not see her as an heiress or a duchess, but as the intelligent, capable woman she had worked so hard to become. In their home, conversations were not dictated by protocol, but flourished from genuine curiosity and shared interests. She had spent her youth in a gilded cage, her every move choreographed. Now she was soaring, her spirit as free as the airplanes her husband piloted. She had known the weight of a coronet and the emptiness of a title, but it was here, in a love chosen for herself, that she finally discovered the one thing her vast fortune could never buy: a true and equal partnership. The little girl who had been sold for a crown had, in the end, crowned herself with contentment. Their homes were not palaces, but sanctuaries. In the south of France, the Villa Louviers, I became a haven of light and warmth, a world away from the damp stone corridors of Blenheim. Here, the air was scented with lavender and pine, and the rooms were filled not with intimidating old masters, but with modern art that sparked joy. Across the Atlantic, they created an elegant life in New York, a city that had once been the stage for her mother's ambitions, but was now a backdrop for her own quiet contentment. These were homes built for living, not for show, designed for comfort and conversation rather than impressing foreign dignitaries. Their shared life was a tapestry woven from mutual interests and deep respect. Jack, a visionary in aviation and industry, admired Consuelo's sharp intellect and her passionate work in philanthropy. Together, they traveled the world, not as exiled aristocrats, but as curious explorers. They read the same books, debated new ideas, and entertained a circle of friends that included artists, writers, and innovators. The rigid schedules and stifling protocols of her former life were replaced by spontaneous decisions and heartfelt laughter. This was the peaceful, private existence she had been denied for so long, a life where she could simply be herself. In this final chapter, Consuelo Vanderbilt was no longer a symbol or a scandal. She was a woman who had navigated the wreckage of a gilded cage and discovered a verdant landscape on the other side. Her story did not end with a title, but with something far more precious, a quiet and profound happiness earned on her own terms. After a lifetime of playing a part written by others, she had finally authored her own happy ending. Yet the truest freedom often comes not from living a new life, but from telling the true story of the old one. Decades later, with the world once again transformed by war, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson sat down to write her autobiography. She titled it "The Glitter and the Gold," a phrase that perfectly captured the dazzling surface and the cold reality of her Gilded Age experience. Published in 1952, this book was her final, definitive act of reclamation. After a lifetime of being defined by others, by the gossip columns, the historians, and even her own family, she was seizing the pen to write her own history. Her motivation was clear and powerful: to tell her truth, not as a scandal, but as a human story. Within its pages, she wielded a quiet, devastating honesty. She wrote of her mother's manipulation with a clarity that still stung across the years, describing Alva not with overt anger, but with a poignant sadness for the childhood that was stolen. She recalled the moment of her surrender, writing, "I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone," a simple sentence that conveys a universe of despair. Of the marriage itself, she reflected on its profound loneliness, noting that life with the Duke was one of utter emptiness. We had nothing to say to each other. But her memoir was not merely a chronicle of suffering. It was the story of her long, hard-won journey to independence. She detailed her awakening through charity work and the suffrage movement, tracing her path from a passive object to an active, purposeful woman. The book was her testimony, a permanent record ensuring that the world would remember not just the weeping bride, but the resilient survivor. In giving her own account, she transformed a personal scandal into a universal lesson about the cost of sacrificing a heart for a crown. What is the power of a story when it is finally told by the person who lived it? A single broken marriage held up a mirror to an entire system, and the reflection was deeply unsettling. The very public unraveling of the Marlborough-Vanderbilt union did more than just titillate high society. It fundamentally changed the conversation. For decades, the exchange of American dollars for European titles had been viewed as a practical, if cynical, business arrangement, a necessary evil to prop up ancient estates. But Consuelo's story, with its raw details of a locked bedroom and a sobbing bride, forced people to see the human wreckage behind the transaction. It was no longer just a financial strategy. It was a form of emotional barbarism dressed in silk and pearls. The scandal gave a name and a face to the countless other young women who had been silently bargained away, making it impossible to ignore the brutal reality of what these alliances truly demanded. How could such a practice continue when its most famous example was a monument to personal despair? The First World War delivered the final, brutal blow to this gilded commerce. The conflict shattered the old European order, toppling empires and eroding the unshakable power of the landed aristocracy. The vast fortunes that had once been essential for survival were now, in many cases, wiped out by war and revolution. More importantly, the social landscape was transformed forever. The war accelerated the rise of the modern woman, one who had worked in factories, managed finances, and earned her own independence. The idea of a young heiress being forced into a loveless marriage with a near stranger began to seem not just cruel, but profoundly archaic, a relic from a vanished world. The glamorous, tragic figure of the dollar princess faded into history, replaced by a new generation of women who demanded the right to choose their own destinies. The glitter was gone, and all that remained was the cold, hard truth that you cannot build a future on a broken heart. Her epic journey traced the arc of an entire era, from a gilded prison to the open sky. Consuelo Vanderbilt's life became a powerful symbol of transformation, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be extinguished. She began as an oppressed heiress, her value measured only in dollars, and her future bartered away by her own mother. She endured the lonely existence of a trapped duchess, performing a part in a play she never chose, her heart a silent captive in the cavernous halls of Blenheim Palace. Yet she did not remain there. Through sheer force of will, she reshaped her destiny, emerging as an independent woman who finally claimed the love and partnership that had been denied her for so long. Her story was far more than a personal scandal. It was a blazing indictment of the brutal intersection of wealth, power, and gender during the Gilded Age. It revealed a world where immense fortunes and ancient titles were traded over the hearts of young women, who were treated as living currency in a transaction that benefited everyone but themselves. Her forbidden romance with Winthrop Rutherfurd was not a mere footnote. It was the poignant, beating heart of the tragedy, the ghost of a different life that haunted her for decades and gave the lie to the cold perfection of her public facade. Her ultimate rebellion, the divorce that shocked 2 continents, shattered the illusion forever, forcing society to confront the human cost of its own traditions. This incredible story of courage and resilience is now yours. What part of Consuelo's journey resonated most deeply with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more tales of shocking royal history that reveal the true people behind the crown.